Sometimes the hardest thing about losing someone you love is learning how to be brave without them. Maria Santos had been trying to figure that out for 6 months when she found the bleeding stranger in her barn. It was October 1952, and she was barely keeping her small farm together while raising 2 young daughters alone. The man wore an expensive suit and had a bullet wound in his shoulder. Everything about him screamed danger. She should have called the sheriff immediately. Instead, she helped him inside and cleaned his wounds. For 3 weeks, she nursed him back to health while keeping him hidden from the world. When he finally told her who he was, she realized she had saved the life of one of the most feared men in the state. But what would he do for her family in return? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the cracked window panes of the Santos farmhouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors that had once gleamed with pride. Maria stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in lukewarm dishwater, watching the steam rise from her coffee cup on the counter. The silence of the house felt heavier these days, punctuated only by the distant sound of her daughters getting ready for school upstairs. She dried her hands on the faded apron that had belonged to her mother, then her grandmother before that. The fabric was thin now, soft from countless washings, but it still carried the faint scent of the lavender her mother used to grow behind their old house in town. Everything about this place spoke of endings: the peeling paint on the exterior walls, the loose boards on the front porch, the squeaky gate that Antonio had always promised to fix but never quite got around to. Antonio, 6 months gone, and she still found herself listening for his footsteps on the gravel drive, still cooking enough dinner for 4 instead of 3. The heart attack had taken him suddenly on a spring morning much like this one, as he worked in the fields trying to coax life from soil that seemed increasingly reluctant to give it. "Mama, Sophia can't find her arithmetic book." Elena appeared in the doorway, 12 years old, but carrying herself with the careful responsibility of someone much older. She had her father's dark hair and serious brown eyes, eyes that had grown more watchful since the funeral. There was something protective in the way she looked at Maria now, as if she understood that the family's survival rested on increasingly fragile foundations. "Check under her bed again," Maria said, turning to face her eldest daughter. "You know how she tosses things there when she's tired." Elena nodded and disappeared back upstairs, her footsteps deliberate on the creaking wooden steps. Maria could hear her patient voice coaching her younger sister, the way she'd taken to doing since Antonio's death. It broke Maria's heart how quickly Elena had stepped into the role of second parent, shouldering burdens no 12-year-old should have to carry. The farm stretched out beyond the kitchen window, 40 acres of rolling hills that had once supported a modest but comfortable life. Antonio's grandfather had settled here after the First War, clearing the land by hand and building the house board by board. 3 generations of Santos men had worked this soil, and now it fell to a widow who knew more about mending clothes than mending tractors. The vegetables gardens that had once been Antonio's pride showed signs of her inexperience. The tomatoes had suffered from some kind of blight she couldn't identify, and the corn stalks stood shorter than they should have by this time of year. She'd lost nearly half the chickens to a fox she couldn't seem to catch, and the old milk cow had gone dry 2 weeks ago. Every day brought new evidence of how much she didn't know, how much she'd relied on Antonio's steady competence. "Found it!" Sophia's voice rang out from upstairs, bright and cheerful as always. 8 years old, and still young enough to believe that adults could fix anything, that tomorrow would somehow be better than today. She bounded down the stairs 2 at a time, her blonde curls, so different from Elena's dark hair, bouncing with each step. Sophia had inherited Maria's lighter coloring and optimistic nature, though lately Maria wondered if optimism was a luxury they could still afford. "Slow down, little rabbit," Maria called, using the pet name Antonio had given their youngest daughter. "We have plenty of time." But they didn't really. Time was running short in ways the girls didn't understand yet. The bank letters were getting more frequent, their tone growing sharper with each passing month. The property taxes were due in November, and the money from the last harvest, what little there had been, was already stretched thin, covering basic necessities. Maria had sold Antonio's tools, then his truck, then pieces of her grandmother's jewelry, watching their resources dwindle like sand through an hourglass. The girls appeared in the kitchen together, Elena helping Sofia with her sweater buttons while balancing both their school bags on her shoulder. They were beautiful children, Maria thought with a pang of fierce love. Elena with her serious demeanor and quick mind, Sofia with her artist's eye and gentle heart. They deserved so much more than this struggle, so much more than the uncertainty that clouded their future. Mrs. Patterson said she might have some sewing work for you, Elena said carefully, the way she'd learned to deliver potentially good news. Mary Catherine's mother mentioned it at church Sunday. Maria nodded, grateful for her daughter's thoughtfulness. She'd been taking in mending work from the women in town, sitting up late by lamplight to stitch torn hems and replace broken buttons. It brought in a few dollars here and there, but nowhere near enough to keep the farm running. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was skilled enough to repair other people's clothes, but couldn't seem to mend the tears in her own life. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Every little bit helps. She kissed both girls on their foreheads, breathing in the sweet scent of the soap she made from lye and leftover cooking grease. Even the soap was a small economy, one of many she'd learned since becoming the sole provider for her family. After the girls left for school, walking the quarter-mile to where the school bus stopped at the crossroads, Maria allowed herself a few minutes of silence. She poured another cup of coffee and stood on the back porch, looking out over the property that held both her hopes and her fears. The barn needed repairs she couldn't afford. The roof of the main house leaked in 3 places, requiring strategically placed buckets every time it rained. The fence posts were rotting, and without proper boundaries, her remaining livestock wandered into the neighbors' fields, creating tensions she could barely navigate. Everything seemed to be falling apart at once, as if Antonio's death had somehow held back a tide that now threatened to wash away everything they'd built. She'd grown up in town, the daughter of a seamstress who'd taught her to find beauty in careful handwork and to take pride in making do with less. But this overwhelming responsibility of keeping a farm running while raising 2 children alone, this was beyond anything her upbringing had prepared her for. Antonio had been the one who understood the rhythms of planting and harvest, who could read the weather in the color of the clouds and know when to bring in the hay. The morning routine continued with the mechanical precision of survival: feed the remaining chickens, collect the few eggs they still produced, check on the vegetable garden that struggled despite her best efforts. Each task reminded her of how much she was learning by trial and error, how often error seemed to win. By the time she returned to the kitchen, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the rooms, but the house still felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with the girls being at school. It was the kind of emptiness that came from missing a presence that had anchored everything else in place. She sat at the kitchen table with the stack of unpaid bills that seemed to grow larger each week. The electric company, the feed store, the doctor who had attended Antonio in his final hours, everyone patient for now. But patience had limits. She'd learned that creditors could be understanding when they believed payment was simply delayed, but their understanding evaporated when they sensed that payment might never come. The photograph on the mantelpiece showed the family as they'd been just 2 years ago, Maria and Antonio, flanking their daughters in front of the farmhouse, all of them squinting slightly in the bright sun, but smiling with genuine happiness. Antonio's arm was around her waist, solid and reassuring, and both girls leaned into their parents with the unconscious confidence of children who knew themselves to be safe and loved. That photograph had become both a comfort and a source of pain. It reminded her of what they'd been, but also highlighted everything that had been lost. The woman in that picture had never imagined she'd be sitting alone in a kitchen growing cold, wondering if she'd be able to keep her children's home. A knock at the front door interrupted her brooding. Maria smoothed her hair and checked her appearance in the hallway mirror before answering. Standing on her porch was Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring farm, holding a covered dish and wearing the kind of careful expression that suggested she came bearing more than just food. "Good morning, Maria. I brought you some of that cornbread you like so much." Mrs. Henderson was a kind woman in her 60s whose own husband had died several years earlier. She'd been one of the few neighbors who truly understood the peculiar challenges of rural widowhood. "That's very thoughtful of you. Please, come in." Maria led her to the kitchen, grateful for the company despite her embarrassment about the obvious signs of their financial struggles. Mrs. Henderson settled into a chair at the kitchen table, her eyes taking in the stack of bills, the mended curtains, the generally worn appearance of everything in the room. But there was no judgment in her gaze, only the recognition of someone who had walked a similar path. "I wanted to talk to you about something," she said gently. "There's been some talk in town, nothing unkind, you understand, but people are concerned. They see you struggling and they want to help." Maria felt her cheeks flush with shame. Small-town kindness could be both a blessing and a burden, especially when it came attached to well-meaning advice about what a woman in her position should do. "I appreciate everyone's concern, but we're managing." "Are you, though?" Mrs. Henderson's question was gentle but direct. "Maria, there's no shame in admitting that this is too much for one person. Antonio was a good man, but he left you with more responsibility than any woman should have to carry alone." The words hung in the air between them, kind but weighted with implications. Maria knew what came next in these conversations, suggestions about selling the farm, moving back to town, perhaps finding work as a housekeeper or taking in more sewing. All reasonable options that felt like admissions of defeat. "I know people mean well," Maria said carefully, "but this is our home. The girls have roots here. Elena's already lost her father. I don't want her to lose everything else that's familiar." Mrs. Henderson nodded with understanding. "I felt the same way when Harold passed, but sometimes holding on too tightly to what was prevents us from seeing what could be." After Mrs. Henderson left, Maria walked through the house with new eyes, trying to see it as others might. The evidence of their decline was everywhere in the furniture they'd sold, in the bare spaces on the walls where paintings had once hung. In the careful way she'd arranged the remaining pieces to hide the empty spots. The afternoon brought the return of her daughters, Elena stepping off the school bus first and then helping Sophia down the high step. They walked up the long driveway together, Elena carrying both their bags as usual, Sophia chattering about something that had happened in her art class. Watching them approach, Maria felt the familiar surge of fierce protectiveness that had sustained her through the darkest moments of the past 6 months. Whatever else she might lose, whatever compromises she might have to make, she would not let her daughters pay the price for her failures. "How was school?" she asked, as they burst through the kitchen door, bringing with them the energy and noise that made the house feel alive again. "Miss Rodriguez says I'm ready for the advanced arithmetic book," Elena announced, pride evident in her voice, despite her attempts to sound matter-of-fact. "And I drew a picture of our house," Sophia added, pulling a sheet of construction paper from her bag. The drawing showed the farmhouse surrounded by impossibly green grass and a yellow sun with a smiling face, the kind of optimistic vision that only a child could maintain in the face of obvious hardship. Maria studied the picture, noting how Sophia had drawn all 4 of them, standing in front of the house herself, Elena, Sophia, and a tall figure that could only be Antonio. In Sophia's world, apparently, her father was still part of the family portrait. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Maria said, her voice catching slightly. "We'll put it on the refrigerator with the others." The evening routine proceeded, as always homework at the kitchen. Table, a simple dinner of soup and bread, stories read aloud by the fire. But underneath the comforting familiarity, Maria felt the weight of decisions approaching. The bank would not wait forever. The creditors would not remain patient indefinitely, and winter was coming, with heating bills and increased food costs and all the expenses that came with the changing seasons. That night, After tucking both girls into their beds and listening to their prayers, Sophia still faithfully including her father in her nightly blessings, Maria sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea and her mother's old sewing basket. There was mending to be done, both the paying work from Mrs. Patterson and the endless repairs that kept her own family's clothes presentable. As she worked by the warm glow of the table lamp, her thoughts drifted to the path that had brought her to this place. She'd married Antonio when she was 20, moving from her mother's house in town to this farm that had seemed like a grand adventure. They'd been so young, so certain that love and hard work could overcome any obstacle. Perhaps they'd been right, for a while. The early years had been challenging but happy, filled with the satisfaction of building something together. Elena's birth had brought them closer, and Sophia's arrival 4 years later had completed their family in ways Maria hadn't even realized were incomplete. But farms were fragile enterprises, dependent on weather and markets and 1,000 variables beyond anyone's control. There had been good years and lean years, seasons of plenty and seasons of worry. Through it all, Antonio had provided the steady confidence that kept them moving forward, his faith in the land and in their ability to work with it, serving as an anchor for the whole family. Without that anchor, Maria felt herself drifting, carried by currents she didn't understand, toward a future she couldn't quite envision. The practical side of her mind catalogued their options with brutal clarity. Sell the farm, move to town, find whatever work she could, and raise her daughters in rented rooms. It would mean giving up on everything Antonio had worked for, but it would also mean security of a sort. The romantic side of her heart rebelled against such practical thinking. This place held the ghosts of her happiest memories, the echoes of laughter and love that had shaped her daughter's early years. To leave would be to abandon not just a house and land, but a way of life that connected them to something larger than immediate survival. As she finished the last of the mending, Maria found herself thinking about mercy, the small acts of kindness that made survival possible, the grace that allowed people to keep going when logic suggested they should give up. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new evidence of how thoroughly she was in over her head. But tonight, her daughters were safe in their beds, the house was warm, and there was enough food for breakfast. In a world that seemed increasingly uncertain, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps mercy came in small portions, doled out one day at a time to those who needed it most. She folded the finished mending, turned off the lamp, and made her way upstairs to her lonely bed, unaware that in just a few hours an act of mercy would change everything. The October dawn came cold and grey, with frost painting delicate patterns on the windows and a sharp wind that promised winter's early arrival. Maria woke to the sound of something that didn't belong, a low groan that seemed to come from somewhere outside the house. She lay still for a moment, listening, wondering if she'd dreamed it. But there it was again, faint but unmistakably human. She slipped from her bed and moved to the window, careful not to wake the girls. The yard below lay in shadows, but movement near the barn caught her eye. Something dark sprawled against the weathered wood of the building's side, motionless except for what might have been the rise and fall of labored breathing. Maria pulled on her robe and boots, grabbed Antonio's old hunting jacket from the closet, and made her way downstairs as quietly as she could manage. The kitchen door opened with its familiar squeak, and the cold air hit her like a physical blow. She hurried across the yard, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The man lay crumpled against the barn wall, his expensive-looking suit torn and stained with something dark that could only be blood. Even unconscious, there was something about his face that suggested he was accustomed to being in control, to having others defer to his wishes. His dark hair was streaked with grey at the temples, and his hands, one of them pressed against his shoulder, were manicured in a way that spoke of wealth and careful attention to appearance. Everything about him screamed danger. The quality of his clothing, the way he carried himself even in unconsciousness, and the obvious gunshot wound in his shoulder, all of it marked him as someone involved in the kind of business that ended with people bleeding in strangers' barnyards. Maria's first instinct was to go back to the house, lock the doors, and call Sheriff Morrison. But as she stood there in the growing light, studying the stranger's face, she saw something that gave her pause. Beneath the hard edges and expensive grooming, he looked somehow lost, the way Sophia sometimes looked when she woke from a bad dream. There was vulnerability in the way his breathing hitched with each exhale, in the way his hand pressed against the wound, as if he could hold his life inside through sheer will. Maria knelt beside him and touched his forehead. His skin burned with fever, and up close she could see that the bleeding had mostly stopped. The wound was hours old, maybe longer. Whoever had shot him, they'd done it somewhere else, and he'd somehow made his way here before collapsing. "Mister," she whispered, "can you hear me?" His eyes opened, dark brown and surprisingly alert despite his condition. For a moment they stared at each other, and Maria saw recognition flicker across his features, not of her specifically, but of his situation. He was completely at her mercy, dependent on the kindness of a stranger for his survival. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse but cultured, with the faint trace of an accent she couldn't place. "Don't call the police." The request confirmed everything she'd suspected about him, but something in his tone, desperation mixed with dignity, made her hesitate. She thought of the bills stacked on her kitchen table, of Elena's worried face, of Sophia's drawing that still included her father. This man was dangerous, possibly a criminal, certainly someone she should have nothing to do with, but he was also bleeding and alone, far from whatever life had brought him to this point. And Maria had been raised by a mother who believed that mercy was not a luxury to be dispensed when convenient, but a responsibility to be met when encountered. "Can you walk?" she asked. Relief flooded his features, followed quickly by something that might have been gratitude. "I think so, with help." Getting him into the house proved more difficult than either of them had anticipated. He was a large man, solidly built, and the wound had weakened him more than he wanted to admit. They made it across the yard in stages, pausing frequently for him to catch his breath and for Maria to readjust her grip around his waist. The back door, the kitchen, the narrow stairs to the spare room, each obstacle seemed insurmountable until they managed to overcome it. By the time she got him settled on the bed in the small room that had once been Antonio's study, both of them were breathing hard, and the stranger's face had gone pale with exhaustion. "Thank you," he said simply, and the words carried a weight that suggested he understood the risk she was taking. Maria brought water and clean towels from the linen closet, along with the bottle of antiseptic she kept for the girl's scraped knees. The wound was worse than she'd initially thought, a jagged hole in his shoulder that spoke of a bullet that had torn through muscle and possibly bone. It needed proper medical attention, the kind only Dr. Brennan in town could provide. "This should be looked at by a doctor," she said as she cleaned around the edges of the wound. "No doctors." His voice was firm despite his weakness. "And no police, please. You could die if this gets infected." "I'll take that chance." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm asking you to trust me when I say that involving anyone else would put you and your family in danger." "Family?" The word reminded Maria that Elena and Sophia were still asleep upstairs, that they would wake soon and expect their normal morning routine. "How did you explain a wounded stranger to children? How did you maintain the fiction of safety when you'd brought potential violence under your own roof?" "I have daughters," she said quietly. "If you're going to bring trouble to this house—" "I won't," he interrupted. "I give you my word. As soon as I'm able to travel, I'll be gone, and no one will ever know I was here." His word, as if the promise of a man who'd obviously been shot for good reason should provide any comfort. But there was something in his manner, a formality that suggested he took such pledges seriously, that made her want to believe him. The sound of footsteps upstairs announced that the girls were stirring. Maria glanced toward the door, calculating how long she had before they came looking for breakfast. "Stay here," she told him. Don't make any noise. If my daughters see you, if anyone else knows you're here, I understand." He settled back against the pillows, already looking more alert despite his injuries. "What's your name?" The question surprised her. In all the urgency of getting him inside and tending to his wound, they hadn't bothered with introductions. "Maria Santos." "Vincent," he said after a slight hesitation, as if he were deciding which name to give her. "Vincent Romano." Even Maria, who paid little attention to the crime stories that sometimes made the newspapers, recognized that name. The Romano family had been mentioned in connection with various investigations over the years, always as persons of interest, never as defendants. They were rumored to control most of the illegal gambling in 3 states, along with other enterprises that weren't discussed in polite company. Vincent Romano. She'd just brought one of the most dangerous men in the region into her home, cleaned his wounds, and promised to keep his presence secret. The magnitude of her situation hit her like a cold wave, and she had to grip the edge of the bed to steady herself. "You know who I am," he said, reading her expression. "I know the name." "Then you know what kind of man you're helping." There was no pride in his voice, only a kind of weary acknowledgement. "If you want me gone." "Mama?" Sophia's voice drifted down from upstairs, sweet and trusting. "Where are you?" Maria looked at Vincent Romano, this stranger who represented everything she should fear, everything she should protect her daughters from. But she also saw a man who was wounded and alone, who had somehow ended up bleeding in her barnyard in the hour before dawn. "I have to go," she whispered. "Don't make any sound." She closed the door softly behind her and went to start breakfast, to begin another day of pretending that everything was normal, that her world hadn't just shifted in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. But as she stood at the stove, scrambling eggs for her daughters, she found herself thinking about mercy and its complications, about the difference between wisdom and kindness, and about the strange turns that life could take when you acted from the heart instead of the head. Upstairs, Vincent Romano lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of a family beginning their day. A mother's patient voice, children's laughter, the comfortable routine of people who belonged to each other. It had been so long since he'd been part of anything so innocent that he'd almost forgotten such things existed. He touched the gold cufflinks that had somehow survived the night's violence, feeling the engraved initials that connected him to a life he was no longer sure he wanted to reclaim. For now, he was simply a wounded man dependent on the mercy of a stranger, and perhaps that was enough. 3 days passed in a strange rhythm of deception and care. Maria found herself living 2 lives, one as the struggling widow, tending to her daughter's needs, and another as the secret caretaker of a dangerous man who slept in the room above her kitchen. Each morning brought the challenge of maintaining normalcy, while her world had fundamentally shifted. Vincent Romano proved to be a surprisingly considerate patient. He remained silent during the day when the girls were home from school, never moving about when their voices carried through the house. Maria brought him meals on trays, changed his bandages with supplies she'd quietly purchased in town, and found herself drawn into conversations that revealed glimpses of the man beneath the fearsome reputation. "You didn't have to do this," he said on the 3rd evening as she checked his wound. The bleeding had stopped completely, and the angry red inflammation was beginning to subside. "Most people would have called the sheriff. Most people haven't been where I am," Maria replied, adjusting the clean bandage with practiced efficiency. Her hands had grown steady with repetition, no longer trembling as they had that first morning. "Where is that?" She considered the question as she gathered the soiled bandages, desperate enough to recognize desperation in someone else. Vincent studied her face in the lamplight. "Your husband, how long has he been gone?" 6 months. The words came easier now than they had in those first raw weeks. Heart attack. He was working in the South Field, trying to fix the irrigation system before the spring planting. "I'm sorry." The simple condolence, offered without expectation of response, somehow meant more than the elaborate expressions of sympathy she'd received from well-meaning neighbors. Perhaps because it came from someone who understood loss in ways that went beyond the ordinary sorrows of farm life. "He left debts," she found herself saying, surprising herself with the admission. "I didn't know about them until after the funeral." Vincent's expression darkened. "What kind of debts?" "Gambling debts. To people in town who loan money at high interest." Maria set down the medical supplies and sank into the chair beside the bed. "I think he was trying to make enough to catch up on the mortgage, to save the farm. But the more he lost, the more he borrowed, thinking the next hand would change everything." "How much?" The directness of the question should have offended her, but instead she found it oddly comforting. Vincent Romano might be a criminal, but he was also someone who understood the realities of money and debt in ways her well-meaning neighbors did not. $3,000, with the interest. More than this place is worth, probably. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, and Maria thought she saw something flicker across his features, calculation perhaps, or recognition of a familiar pattern. "Who holds the debt? A man named Sal Benedetto. He owns the pool hall in town, but people say he has other business interests." The change in Vincent's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. His body tensed, and his eyes hardened in a way that reminded Maria exactly who she was harboring in her home. "Sal Benedetto," he repeated, and there was something in his tone that made her wish she'd never mentioned the name. "You know him?" "We've done business." Vincent's voice carried an edge that suggested their business relationship had not been entirely pleasant. "He's small-time, but vicious, the kind of man who enjoys making others suffer." As if summoned by the mention of his name, the sound of a car engine carried through the quiet evening air. Maria moved to the window and peered through the curtains to see headlights turning into her driveway. Her heart sank as she recognized the black sedan Sal Benedetto's car, unmistakable in a community where most people drove pickup trucks or aging family sedans. "Someone's here," she whispered urgently. Vincent was already moving, swinging his legs out of bed despite the obvious pain the motion caused. "Benedetto? I think so." Maria's voice was tight with fear. "What do I do?" "Act normal. You don't know anything about anything." Vincent moved to the window, positioning himself where he could see the yard while remaining hidden. "And whatever you do, don't let him into the house." The car door slammed, and heavy footsteps approached the front porch. Maria smoothed her hair and took a deep breath, trying to compose herself as the knock came 3 sharp raps that somehow managed to sound threatening. She opened the door to find Sal Benedetto standing on her porch, his bulk filling the doorframe. He was a man who cultivated an appearance of casual menace, with thick shoulders and hands that looked more accustomed to violence than the legitimate business he claimed to run. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Mrs. Santos, beautiful evening, isn't it?" "Mr. Benedetto." Maria kept her voice steady, her hand firm on the door handle. "What brings you out here so late?" "Business, I'm afraid. The kind that doesn't keep regular hours." His eyes moved past her, trying to see into the house. "Mind if I come in? This might take a while." "I was just putting my daughters to bed. Perhaps we could talk tomorrow." The smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "See, that's the thing about business, Mrs. Santos. It doesn't wait for convenient times. Your late husband understood that." "What exactly do you want?" "What I've always wanted. What's owed to me." Sal reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded paper. $3,200, with this month's interest, due in full. Maria took the paper with hands that she willed not to shake. The numbers were written in Antonio's familiar handwriting, along with his signature and the date just 2 weeks before his death. "I don't have that kind of money." "I know you don't, but you do have this place." Sal's gesture encompassed the house, the barn, the fields beyond. "Nice property. worth more than enough to cover what's owed, with a little left over for you and the girls. This is our home. Was your home. Now it's collateral." The false friendliness dropped from his voice like a discarded mask. "I've been patient, Mrs. Santos, more patient than I usually am. But patience has limits." Through the window behind her, Maria could sense Vincent's presence, could almost feel the tension radiating from the hidden room. She wondered what he was thinking, whether his connection to Sal Benedetto might somehow make things better or infinitely worse. "I need more time." Time for what? To find money that doesn't exist? Sal stepped closer, and Maria caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with cigarettes and something else, something that spoke of violence and fear. "Face facts, lady. You're a widow with 2 kids and a failing farm. You can't pay what's owed, and we both know it. There has to be another way." "There is." His smile returned, but it was worse than his threats. "You sign over the deed, and I forgive the debt. You and the girls can stay on as caretakers, pay me reasonable rent. Everybody wins. Everybody except her family, who would lose the only security they had left." Maria looked at the paper in her hands, at Antonio's signature that had sealed their fate, and felt the weight of impossible choices. "I need to think about it." "Sure you do." Sal reached into his pocket again and withdrew a business card. "You think all you want, but I'll need an answer by the end of the week. After that, well, let's just say I might not be feeling so generous." He tipped his hat and walked back to his car, leaving Maria standing in the doorway with her heart pounding and her mind racing. As the taillights disappeared down the road, she closed the door and leaned against it, fighting the urge to collapse under the weight of her situation. When she returned to Vincent's room, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed, his face grim in the lamplight. "How much did you hear?" she asked. "Enough." Vincent's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. "Antonio's debt to Benedetto, it wasn't gambling." Maria stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean your husband wasn't a gambler, Mrs. Santos. He was desperate enough to borrow money from a loan shark to save his farm, but he wasn't a gambler." Vincent met her eyes steadily. "Sal Benedetto is a predator. He finds people in difficult situations and offers them hope, then uses their desperation to take everything they have." The implications of his words hit her like a physical blow. "You're saying Antonio was cheated?" "I'm saying that Sal Benedetto has been planning to take this farm for longer than you know. Your husband's death just made it easier." In the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, marking another step toward the deadline that would determine her family's fate. Maria sank into the chair beside the bed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of forces arrayed against her. "What am I going to do?" Vincent Romano, dangerous man though he was, looked at her with something that might have been compassion. "Let me worry about Sal Benedetto." "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm telling." His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "No one threatens a woman who showed me mercy." The 4th morning brought an unexpected complication. Sophia woke early with a fever, her small face flushed, and her breathing slightly labored. Maria sat beside her daughter's bed, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead and trying to calculate whether this was serious enough to warrant a trip to Dr. Brennan in town. "My throat hurts, Mama," Sophia whispered, her voice hoarse and fragile. "I know, sweetheart. Just rest." Maria smoothed her daughter's damp curls, fighting the familiar panic that came with childhood illness when you were the only adult responsible for making decisions. Elena appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school, but wearing the worried expression that had become too common since their father's death. "Is she very sick?" "Just a cold, I think. But she'll need to stay home today." Maria kept her voice calm and reassuring, though inside she was calculating the complications this would create. Sophia home meant no privacy for tending to Vincent, no opportunity to bring him meals without risking discovery. "I could stay home too," Elena offered with the quick generosity that made Maria's heart ache. "Help take care of her." "No, darling, your education is too important. I can manage." After Elena left for school, walking reluctantly down the driveway and looking back twice, Maria found herself facing a problem she hadn't anticipated. Sophia would need constant attention, but Vincent also needed care. His bandages required changing, and he hadn't eaten since yesterday evening. She settled Sophia on the living room couch with extra pillows and blankets, positioned so she could see out the window to watch for birds and passing clouds. Then she slipped upstairs with a breakfast tray, moving as quietly as possible. Vincent was awake, propped against pillows and looking considerably better than he had in days. The color had returned to his face, and when he moved to accommodate the breakfast tray, she noticed that his movements were less guarded, less careful. "Your daughter?" he asked quietly, having obviously heard Sophia's coughing. "A cold, I think. She's sleeping downstairs." Maria set the tray across his lap, scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee that was still steaming. "This might be the last hot meal I can bring you for a day or two." "I understand." Vincent studied her face with the attention she'd learned to expect from him, the way he seemed to see more than most people revealed. "You look exhausted." "I'm fine." But even as she said it, Maria felt the weight of sleepless nights and constant worry settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. "When did you last have a full night's sleep?" The question surprised her with its gentleness. "I don't remember." Vincent set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. "Maria, you can't take care of everyone else if you don't take care of yourself." "I don't have a choice. There's always a choice." His voice carried a certainty that made her wonder. What choices he'd made in his own life, what paths had led him to her barn that October morning. "Let me help. You're injured. You need to rest. And I'm going stir-crazy lying in this bed while you run yourself ragged." Vincent pushed back the covers and swung his legs to the floor, moving carefully but with obvious determination. "I can sit with your daughter for a few hours, let you get some sleep." The idea was so impossible that Maria almost laughed. "I can't let a stranger watch my child. Especially not." She stopped herself before finishing the sentence. "Especially not a criminal." Vincent's tone held no offense, only acknowledgement. "I understand. But I'm also a man who knows what it's like to worry about someone you love." There was something in his voice that made Maria look at him more closely, seeing past the expensive suit and dangerous reputation to something more personal underneath. "You have children?" "Had." The single word carried a weight of loss that made Maria's breath catch. "A daughter." She would have been about Sophia's age now. The past tense hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Maria didn't dare explore. But it explained something about the way Vincent had listened to her daughter's voices in the hallway, the gentle attention he paid when Sophia's laughter drifted up from downstairs. "What happened?" "Car accident. 3 years ago." Vincent's hands, she noticed, were completely steady as he reached for his coffee. But there was something in his eyes that suggested the steadiness cost him effort. "My wife was driving. They were going to visit her mother." "I'm sorry." "So am I." He met her gaze directly. "Which is why I understand what you're going through. And why I'm not going anywhere until I know you and your girls are safe." The conversation was interrupted by Sophia's voice, calling from downstairs, thin and plaintive. "Mama, I don't feel good." Maria hurried down to find her daughter sitting up on the couch, looking pale and miserable. Sophia's fever seemed higher, and when Maria touched her forehead, the heat radiating from her skin sent a spike of genuine alarm through her chest. "I think I'm going to be sick," Sophia whispered. The next few hours passed in a blur of cool cloths, careful spoonfuls of broth, and the exhausting vigilance that came with nursing a sick child. Sophia's fever climbed through the morning, and by noon Maria was genuinely frightened. But leaving to fetch Dr. Brennan would mean leaving Sophia alone, and she couldn't bear the thought of her daughter waking up afraid and calling for her mother who wasn't there. She was changing Sophia's sweat-soaked nightgown when she heard footsteps on the stairs, careful, measured steps that she recognized immediately. Vincent appeared in the living room doorway, moving slowly, but under his own power. "You shouldn't be up," Maria said, but her protest lacked conviction. The truth was, she was grateful to see another adult, even one who represented complications she couldn't afford. "How is she?" Vincent approached the couch with the kind of quiet caution that suggested experience with sick children. "Her fever is high. I should probably take her to the doctor, but I don't want to move her, and I can't leave her alone." Vincent knelt beside the couch with a careful grace that spoke of recent injury. But his attention was entirely focused on Sophia. She looked up at him with the wide, solemn eyes of a sick child, taking in his unfamiliar face without fear. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "I'm Vincent. I'm a friend of your mother's." Sophia considered this information with the seriousness she brought to all new experiences. "Are you the nice man who's been staying upstairs?" Maria's heart stopped, but Vincent's expression didn't change. "Have you known I was here?" "I heard you walking around at night sometimes. And Mama's been making extra food." Sophia's logic was unassailable in the way that only children's logic could be. "I drew you a picture." She reached under her pillow and withdrew a piece of construction paper that Maria hadn't seen before. The drawing showed their house, just as the previous one had, but this time there were 5 figures standing in front of it: Maria, Elena, Sophia, and 2 taller figures that could only represent Antonio and Vincent. Vincent studied the picture with the kind of attention he might have given an important document. "This is beautiful, Sophia. Thank you. Mama says Papa is in heaven now, but I thought maybe you could stay instead, so we wouldn't be alone anymore." The simple words hit both adults like a physical blow. Maria felt tears spring to her eyes, while Vincent's face went very still, in a way that suggested he was struggling with emotions he wasn't accustomed to showing. "That's very kind of you," he said finally, "but I can't stay forever." "Why not?" "Why not? Because I have to go back to my life, my work." Sophia considered this with the pragmatism of childhood. "Is your work more important than taking care of people?" The question hung in the air, deceptively simple, but carrying implications that went to the heart of who Vincent Romano was and who he might choose to become. He looked at Maria over Sophia's head, and she saw something in his expression that might have been the beginning of an answer. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm still figuring that out." By evening, Sophia's fever had broken, and she was sleeping peacefully for the first time all day. Vincent had spent the afternoon on the living room floor, playing simple card games with her and telling carefully edited stories about places he'd traveled. Maria watched from the kitchen as her daughter, who had been shy around strangers since her father's death, gradually relaxed in Vincent's presence. There was something about the way he spoke to Sophia, a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything Maria knew about his reputation. He answered her questions with the kind of patient seriousness that suggested he found children worthy of honest conversation. And when Sophia finally dozed off during one of his stories, he had covered her with the quilt, with the careful tenderness of someone who remembered tucking in his own child. "She likes you," Maria said as they stood together in the kitchen, speaking in low voices so as not to wake Sophia. "She reminds me of my daughter." Vincent's voice was quiet, reflective. Same curiosity, same way of asking questions that make you think about things you'd rather not examine too closely. "What was her name, your daughter?" "Isabella." He smiled, and for a moment the dangerous man disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who had once pushed a little girl on a swing and helped her with her homework. She wanted to be an artist, like Sophia. Always drawing pictures, always seeing things the rest of us missed. Maria felt something shift in her understanding of the man who had appeared in her barn, like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. Vincent Romano might be everything people said he was: dangerous, ruthless, connected to a world of violence that had no place in her children's lives. But he was also a father who had lost his child, a man carrying grief that perhaps matched her own. "The picture she drew today," Maria said, "with all of us together, She's been doing that since Antonio died, adding him to family pictures as if he were still here. But this is the first time she's added someone new. Vincent turned to look at her, and in the warm light of the kitchen lamp, she could see the conflict playing across his features, the pull between the life he'd always known and the possibility of something different. "I should go soon," he said, "before I bring more trouble to your door." "Is that what you want?" The question surprised him. She could tell. Perhaps no one had asked Vincent Romano what he wanted in a very long time. "What I want," he said finally, "and what's best for you and your girls might be two very different things." Maria thought about Sophia's drawing, about the way her daughter had instinctively included Vincent in their family portrait, and about her own growing sense that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was also the most necessary. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe sometimes what we want and what we need turn out to be the same thing, even when we can't see it at first." Outside, the October wind rattled the windows and reminded them both that winter was coming, with all its demands for warmth and shelter and the kind of security that seemed increasingly fragile in a world where good people struggled and predators like Sal Benedetto circled like wolves around the wounded. The fifth day brought Vincent's past to Maria's doorstep, in the form of two men in dark suits who drove slowly past the farm 3 times before parking at the crossroads where the school bus stopped. Maria watched them from her kitchen window, her heart hammering against her ribs as she recognized the deliberate way they surveyed her property. Vincent appeared beside her at the window, moving with the careful silence that had become second nature during his recovery. His shoulder was still tender, but the dangerous alertness had returned to his eyes, the predator's instinct that had kept him alive in a world where weakness meant death. "Friends of yours?" Maria asked, though she already knew the answer from the tension radiating through his body. "Business associates. The kind who don't make social calls." Vincent's voice was grim as he studied the men through the thin curtain. "They're looking for me, but they're not sure I'm here. Otherwise they would have come directly to the door." "What do they want?" "To finish what they started." Vincent moved away from the window, his movements precise and economical, in a way that reminded Maria exactly how dangerous he could be. There was a disagreement about territory, about respect. Some people thought I had grown too comfortable, too powerful. They decided to send a message, by killing you, by trying to. The correction came with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. They made the mistake of assuming I would go quietly into retirement. Or the grave. Maria thought about Sophia's drawing upstairs, about the way her daughter had instinctively included Vincent in their family portrait, and felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. "You have to leave." "I know. I mean now. Today. Before they figure out where you are." Vincent turned to face her fully, and Maria saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. It wasn't fear, she doubted. Vincent Romano was capable of genuine fear, but something more complex, more personal. "If I leave now, Benedetto will come for you within the week. Without protection, without anyone to stand between him and what he wants, you'll lose everything." Vincent's voice was matter of fact, but there was steel beneath it. "Is that what you want?" "I want my daughters to be safe. Then you need me to stay until this is finished." The sound of the school bus approaching ended their conversation. Elena and Sophia would be home soon, expecting their normal afternoon routine of homework and snacks, and the comfortable predictability that Maria had worked so hard to maintain. How did you explain to children that their world was about to become more dangerous than they could possibly imagine? Vincent seemed to read her thoughts. "They don't need to know anything has changed. Business like this, it gets settled quickly one way or another. And if it gets settled the wrong way, then you'll be free of both problems at once." The casual way he spoke about his own death should have been reassuring, but instead it made Maria feel something she hadn't expected, a sharp pang of loss at the thought of Vincent Romano disappearing from their lives as suddenly as he had appeared. The girls burst through the kitchen door with their usual energy, Elena helping Sophia with her coat while chattering about something that had happened during recess. They seemed oblivious to the tension that filled the house, caught up in the innocence of childhood concerns that had nothing to do with men in dark suits or debts that could never be repaid. "How are you feeling, little rabbit?" Maria asked, kneeling to check Sophia's forehead for any lingering fever. "Much better. Can Vincent play cards with us again?" The question brought both relief and fresh worry. Sophia's easy acceptance of Vincent's presence was touching, but it also complicated everything. How did you protect children from caring about someone who might disappear without warning? "Vincent needs to rest," Maria said. "Carefully. He's still recovering." "From what?" Elena asked, with the sharp curiosity of a 12-year-old who had learned to pay attention to the undercurrents of adult conversation. Vincent appeared in the doorway before Maria could answer, moving with the careful casualness he'd perfected over the past few days. "From being clumsy enough to fall off a ladder while helping your mother fix the barn roof." It was a good lie, simple and believable, but Elena's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied Vincent's face. She was too smart, Maria realized, too aware of the small inconsistencies that didn't quite add up to the story they were telling. "I didn't know Mama was fixing the roof," Elena said. "It was a small job, nothing to worry about." Vincent's voice was steady, but Maria could see the calculation in his eyes as he measured how much Elena suspected and how much she might figure out on her own. The afternoon proceeded with careful normalcy. Vincent retreated upstairs while the girls did their homework at the kitchen table, their voices a comforting counterpoint to Maria's growing anxiety. Every car that passed on the distant road made her tense. Every unfamiliar sound sent her to the window to check for threats that might be approaching. As evening approached, the men in the dark suits drove past one more time, their scrutiny more focused now, as if they were narrowing down possibilities. Maria watched them through a crack in the curtains, noting the way the passenger pointed toward their mailbox, toward the narrow drive that led to the house. "They're getting closer," she told Vincent when she brought him dinner. "I know. I've been watching." Vincent accepted the plate of stew and bread, but his attention remained fixed on the window. "Tomorrow they'll probably come to the door, ask questions about strangers in the area, maybe offer money for information. What should I tell them? The truth, that you haven't seen anyone matching my description." Vincent met her eyes steadily. "Because by tomorrow morning, you won't have." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. "You're leaving tonight?" "I have to. Staying any longer puts you and the girls at risk, and I won't be responsible for that." Maria sank into the chair beside his bed, overwhelmed by emotions she hadn't expected to feel. Over the past week, Vincent had become more than just a patient she was nursing back to health. He had become a presence that made the house feel less empty, a source of strength when her own reserves were running dangerously low. "What about Sal Benedetto? What about the debt?" "I'll handle Benedetto from a distance. He won't bother you again." "How can you be sure?" Vincent's smile was thin and cold, reminding Maria once again of who she was dealing with. "Because Sal Benedetto is a small-time predator who survives by picking on people who can't fight back. Once he understands that you have protection, real protection, he'll find easier prey. And if he doesn't understand, then he'll learn the hard way that some lessons are more expensive than others." The conversation was interrupted by Sophia's voice, calling from downstairs. "Mama, can Vincent come say goodnight? I made him another picture." Maria looked at Vincent, seeing her own conflict reflected in his eyes. How did you say goodbye to a child who had already suffered one abandonment, who had drawn you into her family portrait with the unconscious faith that adults would stay when they promised to care? "She doesn't understand," Maria said quietly. "Children never do. That's what makes them worth protecting." Vincent rose from the bed with careful movements, straightening his clothes with the automatic precision of a man accustomed to maintaining appearances under all circumstances. "I'll say good night, but I won't lie to her about leaving. They found Sophia in her nightgown, sitting cross-legged on her bed, with a fresh drawing spread across her lap. This one showed Vincent sitting at their kitchen table, sharing a meal with the family, his face rendered with the careful attention to detail that marked all of Sophia's artistic efforts. "I wanted you to have this," she said, holding up the picture, "so you won't forget us when you go back to your work." Vincent took the drawing with hands that Maria noticed trembled slightly. "I could never forget you, Sophia. Any of you. Will you come back and visit?" The question hung in the air, heavy with hope and the kind of trust that children offered so freely, never imagining it might not be returned. Vincent knelt beside Sophia's bed, bringing himself to her eye level with the careful attention he always paid when speaking to her. "I don't know," he said honestly. "My work takes me far away sometimes, and I can't always control when I can return. But you'll try?" "I'll try." Sophia seemed satisfied with this promise, perhaps because she had learned that sometimes trying was all adults could offer. She hugged him with the fierce affection of childhood, and Maria saw Vincent close his eyes as if he were memorizing the moment. Elena appeared in the doorway, already in her pajamas but wearing an expression that suggested she had been listening to the conversation from the hallway. She studied Vincent with the serious attention she brought to problems she was trying to solve. "You're leaving because of those men who were watching the house today," she said. It wasn't a question, and Vincent didn't treat it as one. "You noticed them." "I noticed lots of things." Elena's voice carried a maturity that made Maria's heart ache. "Are they bad men?" "Some men are bad, Elena, but that doesn't mean all men are, and it doesn't mean the bad ones always win." "Will they hurt Mama?" The directness of the question, the adult fear in a child's voice, seemed to hit Vincent harder than any of the physical pain he had endured. He looked at Elena with the kind of respect reserved for equals, recognizing that she deserved an honest answer. "Not if I can help it." "Promise?" "I promise." Elena nodded once, apparently satisfied that Vincent's word could be trusted. "Then I guess you have to go do whatever you need to do." Later, after both girls were asleep, Maria walked Vincent to the kitchen door. He had changed back into his original clothes, the expensive suit cleaned and mended as well as she could manage. The bloodstains removed, but the bullet hole still visible if you knew where to look. "The prayer beads in your coat pocket," she said suddenly. "I saw them when I was cleaning your clothes. Do you still believe?" Vincent's hand moved unconsciously to his coat pocket, where the worn rosary rested against his chest. "I'm not sure what I believe anymore, but old habits die hard. Maybe faith isn't about being sure. Maybe it's about hoping even when you can't see the reasons why." Vincent looked at her in the dim light of the kitchen. This woman who had taken him in when he was bleeding and desperate, who had cared for him without asking for anything in return. "You have more faith than anyone I know." Maria Santos. "I had to learn it the hard way. The best kind usually is." He moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to her. "The deed to this property, where do you keep it?" "In the strong box in Antonio's desk." "Why?" "Because Benedetto is going to come for it sooner than you think. Keep it with you. Don't let it out of your sight." Vincent's voice carried the authority of a man who understood exactly how predators operated. "And if anyone comes to the door claiming legal authority to take it, don't sign anything until you've had it examined by someone you trust." "Who can I trust with something like this?" "Father McKenna at St. Catherine's. He's helped families in situations like yours before, and he knows enough about the law to spot fraud when he sees it." The suggestion surprised Maria. "You know Father McKenna?" "I know his reputation. In my business, you learn to recognize the people who can't be bought or intimidated." Vincent smiled, and for a moment the dangerous man disappeared entirely. "He'll help you because it's the right thing to do, and he won't ask questions about where the advice came from." Vincent stepped into the night, becoming a shadow among shadows, with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to move unseen. Maria stood in the doorway until she could no longer distinguish his form from the darkness, then closed and locked the door against a world that suddenly felt much more dangerous than it had when he was sleeping upstairs. In her pocket, Sophia's drawing crinkled as she moved, a reminder of the faith that children offered so freely and the responsibility that came with accepting it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new evidence of how thoroughly she was in over her head. But tonight, for the first time since Antonio's death, she didn't feel entirely alone. 3 weeks passed, with the strange quiet that follows a storm. Maria found herself listening for footsteps that would never come, setting the table for 4 before remembering that Vincent was gone. The girls adapted with the resilience of childhood, though Sophia continued to ask when their friend would return, and Elena watched the road with eyes that had grown too knowing for 12 years old. The men in dark suits never came to the door. They disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving Maria to wonder whether Vincent had found them or they had found him. The uncertainty gnawed at her during the long October nights, when the wind rattled the windows and reminded her how alone they really were. Maria's mother's rosary became her constant companion during those weeks, the worn beads sliding through her fingers as she prayed for guidance she wasn't sure would come. She had inherited the rosary, along with her mother's faith, both precious things that had sustained her through Antonio's death and the grinding poverty that followed. "Hail Mary, full of grace," she whispered in the darkness of her bedroom, the familiar words a lifeline in a world that seemed increasingly uncertain. "Blessed art thou among women." But even prayer couldn't silence the practical concerns that multiplied like weeds in her mind. The bills continued to arrive, the creditors continued to call, and Sal Benedetto's deadline approached like gathering storm clouds on the horizon. She found work where she could, cleaning Mrs. Patterson's house twice a week, taking in more mending, selling eggs and vegetables to neighbors who paid more out of kindness than genuine need. Every dollar helped, but it was like trying to fill a bathtub with a teaspoon while someone held the drain open. Elena noticed everything, as she always did. "Mama, why do you count the money so many times?" she asked one evening, as Maria sat at the kitchen table with the day's small earnings spread before her. "I want to make sure it's all there," Maria replied, though the truth was more complicated. She counted the money because the act of counting gave her something to do with her hands, while her mind wrestled with impossible mathematics. "It's never enough, is it?" The question, delivered with Elena's characteristic directness, hit Maria like a physical blow. She looked at her eldest daughter and saw not the child she wanted to protect, but the young woman Elena was becoming someone who understood that their world balanced on the edge of catastrophe. "We're managing," Maria said, falling back on the phrase she'd used so often it had lost all meaning. "Are we, though?" Elena sat down across from her mother, her expression serious. "I hear you crying at night sometimes. I see how you look when you think we're not watching." Maria's hands stilled on the money she'd been counting. "Elena, I know about the farm, Mama. I know about the debt." Elena's voice was gentle but implacable. "I heard you talking to Mrs. Henderson about it, and I heard that man, Mr. Benedetto, when he came to the door. The admission hung between them like a bridge that, once crossed, could never be rebuilt." Maria had tried so hard to shield her daughters from the full extent of their situation, but Elena's intelligence had always made such shielding temporary at best. "What else do you know?" "I know that Vincent wasn't really here to fix the barn roof. I know he was hurt, and you took care of him." Elena's eyes were steady, older than her years. "And I know he left because staying would have brought trouble to our family." Maria felt tears threatening, surprised by the relief that came with having her secrets acknowledged. "I was trying to protect you, both of you. I know, but I'm not a little girl anymore, Mama. And Sophia's tougher than you think." Elena reached across the table and covered Maria's hands with her own. "Maybe we could protect each other better if we were honest about what we're facing." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car in the driveway, not the familiar rumble of a neighbor's truck, but the smooth purr of an expensive engine. Maria moved to the window and felt her heart sink as she recognized Sal Benedetto's black sedan pulling up to the house. "Take Sophia upstairs," she told Elena quietly. "Whatever happens, whatever you hear, don't come down until I call for you." Elena nodded once and disappeared up the stairs with the quick efficiency of someone who understood that some adult conversations were too dangerous for children to witness. Maria smoothed her hair, checked her appearance in the hallway mirror, and opened the front door before Sal could knock. He stood on her porch with two other men, both larger and more obviously threatening than the loan shark himself. In the evening light, they looked like shadows given human form, dark shapes that absorbed rather than reflected the dying Sunday. "Mrs. Santos." Sal's smile was as cold as she remembered. "I hope you've had time to think about our last conversation." "I have. And... Maria's hand moved unconsciously to the rosary in her pocket, the worn beads, a reminder of prayers offered and faith maintained, despite all evidence that God had forgotten about one struggling widow and her children. "I need more time." Sal's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him, a subtle increase in menace that made Maria's skin crawl. "Time for what, Mrs. Santos? To find money that doesn't exist? To discover some miraculous solution that will make your problems disappear? Time to find another way. There is no other way." Sal stepped closer, close enough that Maria could smell his cologne and the underlying scent of violence that seemed to cling to him like smoke. "You owe me money you don't have, secured by property you can't afford to keep. The arithmetic is simple. The debt was my husband's, not mine. Your husband is dead. His debts became your debts the moment they put him in the ground." Sal's voice carried the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "That's how it works in the real world, Mrs. Santos. The living pay for the choices of the dead." Maria thought of Vincent's warning, of the way he'd told her to guard the deed and trust no one except Father McKenna. "I want to see the original paperwork, every document my husband signed, witnessed by a lawyer." For the first time, Sal's composure flickered. It was subtle, a slight tightening around his eyes, a pause that lasted just a heartbeat too long, but Maria caught it and filed it away as significant. "The paperwork is in order. Then you won't mind showing it to me." "I don't have to show you anything. You know what's owed, and you know what happens if it's not paid." Sal gestured toward his companions, who stepped forward slightly, their bulk casting longer shadows across the porch. "I've done to grow, been patient because I'm a reasonable man. But patience has limits, as does mercy." The words came out before Maria realized she was going to speak them, carrying a quiet strength that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise Sal. She thought of Vincent, of the way he'd promised to handle Benedetto from a distance, and wondered if faith sometimes meant believing in protection you couldn't see. "What did you say?" "I said mercy has limits too, and I think you might be surprised by where those limits are." Sal studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to read something written there in a language he didn't quite understand. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mrs. Santos." "I'm not playing anything. I'm just a widow trying to take care of her children." "Then take care of them by being smart. Sign over the deed, accept my generous offer, and everyone walks away happy." Sal reached into his jacket and withdrew a folder of papers. "I even brought the paperwork to make it easy for you." Maria looked at the documents he held out to her, then at the men flanking him on her porch, and felt something crystallize inside her, not courage. Exactly. But something harder and more durable than fear. No. The single word seemed to echo in the evening air, simple and final, and completely unmovable. Sal's expression shifted from surprise to anger, and for a moment Maria thought he might order his companions to take what he wanted by force. Instead, he carefully folded the papers and returned them to his jacket pocket. "You have until Saturday, Mrs. Santos. After that, we'll be having a different kind of conversation." "What happens Saturday?" "Saturday is when I stop being reasonable." Sal tipped his hat with mocking courtesy. "Enjoy your evening, Mrs. Santos. There aren't many of them left." After they drove away, Maria stood on her porch until the sound of their engine faded completely. Then she went inside, locked the door, and called up the stairs for her daughters. They appeared in the living room with the quick obedience that suggested they'd been listening from the upstairs hallway. Sophia wide-eyed and frightened, Elena pale but composed. "Was that the bad man?" Sophia asked, moving close to her mother's side. "That was Mr. Benedetto," Maria said carefully. "He came to talk about business." "What kind of business?" Elena's question carried the weight of someone who already suspected the answer. Maria looked at her daughter's Elena with her serious dark eyes and premature understanding, Sophia with her artist's sensitivity and innocent faith, and made a decision that went against every protective instinct she possessed. "The kind where we might lose our home." The words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the comfortable fiction that everything was manageable, that adult problems stayed safely in the adult world. But Maria had learned something from her conversation with Elena earlier. Sometimes honesty was the only foundation strong enough to support the weight of genuine love. "Are we going to lose it?" Sophia's voice was small but steady. "I don't know, sweetheart. I'm trying very hard to find a way to keep it." "What about Vincent?" Sophia asked, with the directness that had always characterized her questions. "Could he help us?" Maria felt her throat tighten. "Vincent has his own troubles, little rabbit. We can't ask him to solve ours too." But even as she said the words, Maria found herself thinking about the prayer beads in Vincent's pocket, about the man who had lost his own daughter and found something worth protecting in hers. She thought about the way he'd looked at Sophia's drawings, the careful attention he'd paid to Elena's questions, the promise he'd made to protect them from men like Sal Benedetto. Faith, her mother had always said, meant believing in things you couldn't see. Maybe it also meant trusting in the goodness of people who had every reason to choose otherwise. Outside, the October wind grew stronger, carrying the promise of winter and all the challenges it would bring. But inside their small farmhouse, Maria Santos held her daughters close and prayed to a God she hoped was still listening, while somewhere in the darkness, forces she couldn't see prepared to converge in ways that would change everything. The rosary beads were warm in her hand, worn smooth by generations of faithful fingers, as she whispered the words that had sustained her family through every crisis they had ever faced. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our need." Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Maria's kitchen table. Father McKenna sat across from her, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, his kind eyes serious behind wire-rimmed spectacles. The parish priest was a man who had seen enough of human nature to understand that sometimes salvation came in unexpected forms. "Vincent Romano asked me to check on you," he said without preamble. "He was concerned about your situation with Mr. Benedetto." Maria nearly dropped her own coffee cup. "You know Vincent?" "I've known Vincent for many years, though not in the way you might expect." Father McKenna's smile was gentle but knowing. "He was one of my altar boys, back when his family still lived in the old neighborhood, before life took him down different paths." The revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. Vincent Romano, the feared Mafia capo, had once served at the altar of St. Catherine's, had once been a child who lit candles and rang bells during Mass. "I don't understand." Few people do. They see what Vincent became and assume it was inevitable that some children are born to darkness. Father McKenna sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "But I remember the boy who used to stay after service to help me clean the sanctuary, who asked questions about forgiveness and justice that most adults couldn't answer. What happened to him? The same thing that happens to many children who grow up in poverty and violence. They learn to survive by becoming what the world expects them to be." The priest's voice carried a sadness that spoke of too many lost souls, too many chances for redemption that had slipped away. But sometimes, if they're very fortunate, they encounter mercy when they need it most. Maria thought about the wounded man she'd found in her barn, about the gentle way he'd played cards with Sophia and the careful attention he'd paid to Elena's questions. He's trying to change. He's trying to remember who he was before the world convinced him he had to be someone else. Father McKenna reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded newspaper. Which brings us to why he sent me to see you. The newspaper was 3 days old, from a city 200 miles away. The headline read, "Reputed crime boss Vincent Romano dies in hospital following shooting." Below it was a photograph of Vincent's face, but somehow different. Older, harder, with the kind of emptiness in the eyes that spoke of a man who had lost everything that mattered. Maria stared at the newspaper, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. But he's not dead. He was here, in my house. Vincent Romano, the crime boss, is dead, Father McKenna said gently. The question now is who Vincent chooses to become in his place. I don't understand. The shooting you treated him for, it wasn't random violence or a territorial dispute. It was an execution that Vincent survived by being smarter and more prepared than his enemies expected. The priest's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing parish finances rather than matters of life and death. He used their attempt on his life as an opportunity to disappear, to let the world believe they had succeeded. Maria's hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. The men who were watching the house, they're gone, permanently. Vincent made sure of that before he staged his own death. Father McKenna's tone carried no judgment, only the weary acceptance of a man who had spent decades trying to salvage souls from situations where conventional morality offered no clear answers. And now? Now Vincent Romano legally owns several legitimate businesses, including a small financial services company that specializes in purchasing distressed debts at significant discounts. The priest smiled, and for the first time Maria heard genuine hope in his voice, including, as of yesterday morning, the debt owed by one Maria Santos to one Salvatore Benedetto. The words took several seconds to penetrate, and when they did, Maria felt the world shift beneath her feet. What are you saying? I'm saying that your debt has been purchased by a company that believes in reasonable repayment terms and family-friendly business practices. Father McKenna reached into his other pocket and withdrew a set of official-looking documents. Your new payment schedule calls for $50 per month until the principal is satisfied, with no additional interest or fees. Maria stared at the papers, afraid to touch them, afraid they might dissolve if she breathed on them wrong. How is this possible? Vincent has been planning this for weeks. The staged death, the legitimate business acquisitions, the strategic elimination of threats to your family's safety, all of it carefully orchestrated to give him a new life and you a second chance. But why would he do this for us? Father McKenna's expression softened, because sometimes, Maria, we encounter people who remind us of who we used to be, or who we might still become. Vincent told me about your daughters, about the way Sophia drew him into her pictures of your family, about Elena's questions that made him think about the choices he'd made. Maria felt tears threatening, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Vincent had done. Where is he now? Starting over, learning how to be a legitimate businessman instead of a feared criminal. It won't be easy. Old habits and older enemies don't disappear just because you change your name and occupation. The priest leaned forward, his voice gentle but serious. He asked me to tell you that he keeps his promises, especially the ones he makes to children who draw pictures that include him in their families. The sound of footsteps on the front porch interrupted their conversation. Maria moved to the window and felt her heart sink as she saw Sal Benedetto approaching the door, his expression grimmer than she'd ever seen it. "He's early," she whispered. Father McKenna rose from his chair with the calm dignity that had carried him through decades of ministering to the desperate and the dangerous. "Perhaps it's time, Mr. Benedetto learned about your new financial arrangements." Sal's knock was sharp and impatient, the sound of a man who expected immediate compliance with his demands. Maria opened the door to find him flanked by the same two enforcers, their presence more menacing in the bright morning light. "Mrs. Santos, I hope you've made the right decision." "I have, Mr. Benedetto. I've found another way to handle my husband's debt," Sal's smile was coldly satisfied. I'm glad you've finally seen reason. The papers are in my car. That won't be necessary. Father McKenna appeared beside Maria, his clerical collar immediately recognizable to all three men. Mrs. Santos's debt has been purchased by another party and restructured under more reasonable terms. The change in Sal's expression was immediate and dramatic. The confident predator disappeared, replaced by something much more dangerous, a cornered animal who suddenly realized the tables had been turned. That's impossible. I hold the original note, which has been legally transferred to Romano Financial Services, along with all associated collection rights. Father McKenna's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. I have the documentation if you'd like to review it. Romano? Sal's face went pale. Vincent Romano is dead. Vincent Romano, the crime boss, is dead, Father McKenna agreed. Vincent Romano, the legitimate businessman, however, is very much alive and very interested in ensuring that his clients are treated with appropriate respect. The implications hit Sal like a physical blow. Maria watched as he processed what this meant: that Vincent was alive, that he had outmaneuvered everyone who thought they'd eliminated him, and that he had chosen to use his new position to protect the woman who had shown him mercy when he needed it most. This isn't over, Sal said, but his voice lacked conviction. On the contrary, Father McKenna replied gently, it's very much over. Mrs. Santos is now under the protection of people who take their business relationships seriously. I'm sure you understand what that means. After Sal and his men left their retreat, more like a rout than a strategic withdrawal, Maria sank into her kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of her circumstances. Is it really over? She asked. The debt crisis is over. The threat from Benedetto is over. Father McKenna returned to his seat, his expression thoughtful. But in some ways, Maria, this is just the beginning. What do you mean? I mean that Vincent Romano has burned every bridge to his old life in order to build something new. He's betting everything on the possibility that mercy, once given, creates obligations that transcend the ordinary rules of business and survival. Maria thought about Sophia's drawings, about the way her daughter had instinctively included Vincent in their family portrait, and about the prayer beads he carried in his pocket, despite, or perhaps because of, all the darkness he'd witnessed. Will I see him again? That depends on what kind of man he chooses to become, and whether you're willing to be part of that becoming. Father McKenna finished his coffee and rose to leave. But I suspect, Maria Santos, that this story is far from over. As the priest walked to his car, Maria remained at her kitchen table with the documents that represented her family's salvation spread before her. Outside, the October morning was bright and clear, full of the kind of promise that had been absent from her life for so many months. For the first time since Antonio's death, the future felt like something other than a series of problems to be endured. It felt like a story that was just beginning, written by hands that understood the value of mercy and the power of second chances. In her pocket, her mother's rosary was warm against her fingers, the beads worn smooth by generations of faithful women who had learned that sometimes the most important prayers were the ones that asked for the courage to accept unexpected grace. 2 weeks after Father McKenna's visit, Maria found herself standing in front of St. Catherine's Church, holding the farm deed in her hands and wondering if she had the courage to do what needed to be done. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of October light that made everything seem possible, but her heart hammered against her ribs as she climbed the stone steps. Vincent was waiting in the last pew, dressed in a simple dark suit that bore no resemblance to the expensive clothing he'd worn when she first found him. He looked older somehow, more serious, as if the weight of his transformation had settled permanently on his shoulders. When he saw her, he rose with the careful courtesy that had always marked his interactions with her family. Maria. His voice was quiet, uncertain in a way that reminded her of the wounded man she'd nursed back to health. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would really be here. She sat beside him in the pew, noting how he kept his hands folded carefully in his lap, how his attention seemed divided between her face and the altar where he'd once served as a boy. I wasn't sure either, until this morning. Vincent's smile was rueful. It's been a long time since I sat in a church for any reason other than someone's funeral. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, surrounded by the peace that seemed to permeate the old building. Colored light filtered through stained glass windows, casting patterns of red and blue across the worn wooden floors, and somewhere in the distance they could hear Father McKenna preparing for the noon mass. "The girls ask about you," Maria said finally. "Sophia especially. She's made you 3 more drawings since you left. How are they adjusting to everything? Better than I expected." Elena understands more than she says, and Sophia just seems relieved that we don't have to move. Maria turned to face him fully. "They still include you in their prayers every night?" Something flickered across Vincent's features, surprise perhaps, or gratitude, or something more complex that she couldn't quite identify. "I haven't been prayed for in a very long time. Maybe that's part of the problem." The observation hung between them, gentle but pointed, carrying implications that went beyond conventional consolation. Vincent studied her face in the colored light, seeing something there that made him straighten slightly, as if bracing for a conversation he'd been avoiding. "Father McKenna told you about the business arrangements?" "He did." Maria pulled the farm deed from her purse and held it out to him. "Which is why I need to give this to you." Vincent stared at the document as if it were a snake. "I don't want your farm, Maria. And I don't want to be in debt to you, not even friendly debt." Her voice was firm despite the uncertainty she felt. "You bought Sal's claim against my property, which means you own it now. That's how these things work." "No, it's not. I restructured your debt to give you reasonable payments, nothing more." "With what money, Vincent? With what authority?" Maria's questions were gentle but relentless. "You told me yourself that Vincent Romano, the crime boss, is dead. So who exactly holds my debt now?" The directness of her challenge seemed to surprise him, as if he hadn't expected her to think through the legal implications of his heroic gesture. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the altar, where he'd learned about sacrifice and redemption as a boy. "Someone who wants to help your family. Someone who used money obtained through criminal enterprise to buy legitimate businesses that are now being used to manipulate my family's situation." Maria's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "I appreciate what you did, Vincent, more than you'll ever know. But I won't be owned by anyone, no matter how good their intentions." "You wouldn't be owned, wouldn't I?" Maria leaned forward slightly, forcing him to meet her eyes. "What happens when you decide that $50 a month isn't enough? What happens when you want something from me that I'm not prepared to give? What happens when the authorities start asking questions about how Vincent Romano, the legitimate businessman, acquired his startup capital?" Each question hit him like a physical blow, and Maria could see the moment when he realized she understood the full complexity of what he'd done, not just the mechanics of debt purchase and business reorganization, but the web of obligation and potential compromise that such arrangements always created. "You would never intend to," Maria corrected. "But intentions change, circumstances change, and debts have a way of becoming chains even when they start as gifts." Vincent was quiet for a long time, his hands moving unconsciously to the prayer beads in his pocket. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a humility she'd never heard from him before. "Then what do you want me to do? I want you to accept this deed as payment in full for the passes, debt you purchased. I want you to become my business partner in running this farm as a legitimate enterprise. And I want you to understand that this isn't charity, it's an investment in something that could benefit both our families." The proposal clearly stunned him. "Maria, you don't know what you're asking. I'm asking you to be the man Sophia draws in her pictures instead of the man you used to be." Her voice was steady, certain. "I'm asking you to help me build something decent and honest, something our children could be proud of." Our children? The phrase had slipped out before she realized she was going to say it, but Maria found she didn't want to take it back. Elena and Sophia, Isabella's memory. All the children who deserve to inherit a world that's a little better than the one we found. Vincent's face went very still, and Maria could see him struggling with emotions that went far beyond the business arrangement she was proposing. You would trust me with something that important. I would trust you to try to become worthy of it. The distinction was crucial, and they both knew it. Maria wasn't asking Vincent to be perfect, wasn't demanding that he erase the darkness of his past. She was asking him to choose, every day, to be better than he had been, to build something positive from the wreckage of his old life. The farm is failing, Maria. The soil is poor, the buildings need repair, the equipment is obsolete. Vincent's voice was practical, but she could hear the possibility creeping into it, despite his attempts to remain realistic. It would take years to make it profitable, and there's no guarantee we could ever succeed. Then we failed together, as partners, trying to build something worthwhile. Or we succeed together, proving that mercy isn't wasted on people who know how to accept it. Vincent looked around the church at the altar, where he'd learned about redemption as a boy. At the stations of the cross that told the story of his sacrifice and transformation, at the simple wooden pews where generations of sinners had sought forgiveness and found grace. I don't know how to be a farmer. I don't know how to be a business owner. We'll learn together. I don't know if I can be the kind of man you think I can become. I don't know either. But Sophia thinks you can, and her judgment about people has always been better than mine. The mention of her daughter's faith in him seemed to break through Vincent's remaining resistance. He reached out and carefully took the deed from her hands, his fingers tracing the official seals and signatures that represented everything Maria had left to lose. Equal partners, equal partners. Equal risks, equal rewards, equal responsibility for the choices we make. And if I fail? If the old Vincent comes back and destroys everything we're trying to build? Maria thought about the prayer beads in his pocket, about the way he'd played cards with Sophia and answered Elena's difficult questions, about the man who had risked everything to protect a family that had shown him mercy when he needed it most. Then we deal with that when it happens, but I don't think it will. Why not? Because, Maria said simply, you're already not the same man who collapsed in my barn 6 weeks ago. That man would never have given up everything he'd built to save a widow's farm. That man wouldn't be sitting in a church asking questions about redemption and second chances. Vincent folded the deed carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, next to the prayer beads that connected him to the boy he'd once been. When do we start? We already have. The moment you decided to walk away from your old life instead of trying to go back to it. Outside, the October sun climbed higher in the clear sky, warming the church steps where they would shake hands on a partnership that had nothing to do with normal business arrangements and everything to do with the kind of faith that created possibilities where none had existed before. As they walked together toward the future they would build, Maria found herself thinking about mercy and its complications, about the difference between charity and investment, and about the strange grace that could transform enemies into family when people were brave enough to believe in each other's capacity for change. The farm deed rested in Vincent's pocket, but the real foundation of their partnership was something much more valuable, the recognition that sometimes the most important business you could conduct was the business of helping each other become the people you were meant to be. Saturday afternoon brought Sal Benedetto to Maria's door one final time, but this visit carried a desperation that hadn't been present before. He arrived without his usual enforcers, driving an older car that suggested his circumstances had changed significantly since their last encounter. Maria watched him approach from her kitchen window, noting the way his expensive suit hung differently on his frame, as if he'd lost weight or confidence or both. Vincent stood beside her at the window, no longer hiding his presence. He wore work clothes now, denim and flannel, that spoke of honest labor rather than criminal enterprise, but his posture carried the alert stillness of a man who understood violence even if he no longer courted it. "It looks desperate," Maria observed. "Desperate men are dangerous," Vincent replied, "but they're also predictable." When Sal's knock came, Vincent opened the door before Maria could move. The two men faced each other across the threshold, former criminal associates who now stood on opposite sides of a divide that couldn't be bridged with either violence or negotiation. "Vincent," Sal's voice carried a mixture of relief and calculation. "I heard you were alive, but I wasn't sure." "What do you want, Sal?" The directness of the question seemed to catch Benedetto off guard. He glanced and passed Vincent toward Maria, then back, as if trying to understand the dynamics of whatever arrangement had brought his former colleague to this failing farm. "I want to talk business, the way we used to." "We don't do business anymore." "Come on, Vincent. This legitimate businessman act is fine for the outside world, but we both know who you really are." Sal's smile was oily, familiar. "You can't change your nature just by changing your clothes." Vincent's expression didn't shift, but Maria felt the tension in the air increase. She moved to stand beside him, close enough to offer support without interfering in whatever needed to be resolved between these two men. "You're right," Vincent said calmly. "I can't change my nature, but I can choose what I do with it." Pretty words, but I'm in trouble here, Vincent. Real trouble. The kind that requires the old solutions. Sal stepped closer, lowering his voice. "My gambling operation got raided last week. Federal agents, warrants, the whole show. Someone talked, gave them dates, locations, everything. That's unfortunate." "Unfortunate?" Sal's composure cracked slightly. "3 of my boys are in custody, my books are seized, and half my customers are running scared. I need to disappear for a while, and disappearing takes money I don't have." Vincent's silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Maria could see Sal processing the lack of sympathy, the absence of the automatic loyalty he'd expected from someone who had once operated in the same world. "I thought we were friends, Vincent. Friends don't threaten widows and children. I wasn't threatening anyone. I was collecting on legitimate debt. There was nothing legitimate about what you did to Antonio Santos or his family." Vincent's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "You preyed on a desperate man, manipulated his circumstances, and tried to steal his family's home. That's business." "No, Sal, that's what I used to think was business. Now I know the difference." The distinction seemed to infuriate Benedetto. His mask of desperate friendliness dropped completely, revealing the predator that had always lurked beneath. "You think you're better than me now? You think playing farmer changes what you are?" "I think," Vincent said quietly, "that what I am depends on the choices I make every day, and I choose not to help you hurt more families." Sal's hand moved toward his jacket, and Maria felt her breath catch. But Vincent was faster, his own hand shooting out to grab Sal's wrist with casual efficiency. "I wouldn't," Vincent said, his voice conversational. "Not here, not in front of her." For a moment the two men stood frozen, Vincent's grip on Sal's wrist, the only thing preventing escalation to violence. Maria could see the calculation in Sal's eyes, the weighing of odds that had kept him alive in a dangerous business for 20 years. "This isn't over," Sal said finally. "Yes, it is." Vincent released his wrist and stepped back. "It's over because I'm not the man I used to be, and you're not important enough to make me remember him." The dismissal hit Sal harder than physical violence would have. Maria watched his face cycle through rage, disbelief, and finally a kind of bitter acceptance that suggested he understood exactly how much the balance of power had shifted. "You'll regret this, Vincent. When they come for you, and they will come, you'll wish you had friends who remember what loyalty means. Maybe, but I'll sleep better at night knowing I didn't help you destroy more families." After Sal drove away, his departure more like a retreat than a strategic withdrawal, Vincent remained standing in the doorway, Maria could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." But his voice carried the strain of someone who had just chosen a harder path when an easier one was available. "He's right, though. There will be consequences to turning my back on that world completely." "What kind of consequences?" Vincent turned to face her, and Maria saw something in his expression that might have been fear, not of violence or death, but of losing what he'd found in this small farmhouse with this family who had accepted him despite knowing who he'd been. The kind that test whether redemption is strong enough to survive the weight of the past. Maria thought about her mother's rosary, about the prayers that had sustained her through Antonio's death and the grinding poverty that followed, about the faith that had led her to help a wounded stranger despite every practical reason to turn away. "Then I guess we'll find out together." Vincent's smile, when it came, was the first genuinely happy expression she'd seen from him since he'd returned. "Together sounds better than alone." "It always has," Maria agreed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The business partnership papers arrived by courier on Monday morning, official documents that transformed Vincent Romano from a dangerous secret into Maria's legitimate business associate. They signed the forms at the kitchen table, where she'd once counted coins and worried about unpayable bills, their signatures creating something that had never existed before, a criminal's attempt at honest redemption backed by a widow's faith in second chances. Santos Romano Agricultural Partners. Maria read aloud from the partnership agreement. "It has a nice sound to it." "It has a legal sound to it," Vincent corrected, but there was satisfaction in his voice. "No one can claim this isn't legitimate now." Elena and Sofia had watched the signing ceremony from the doorway, their faces showing the mixture of excitement and uncertainty that came with any major change in their young lives. When the last document was notarized and filed, Sofia approached the table with characteristic directness. "Does this mean Vincent lives here now?" The question hung in the air, deceptively simple but weighted with implications that went far beyond business arrangements. Maria felt her cheeks flush as she realized they'd organized a legal partnership without discussing the practical details of how it would actually function. "Vincent will need to stay here sometimes," she said carefully, "to help with the farm work and make sure everything runs properly. But where will he sleep?" Sophia's artistic mind needed concrete details to build the picture of their new arrangement. Vincent cleared his throat. "I thought I might fix up the barn loft, make it into proper living quarters." "That's silly," Elena said with 12-year-old practicality. "The spare room upstairs is perfectly fine, and you've already stayed there before." The casual way Elena referenced Vincent's earlier presence in their home reminded Maria how much her daughters had accepted without question, how naturally they'd incorporated him into their understanding of family. Sometimes children were wiser than the adults who tried to protect them from complexity. "Elena's right," Maria said, surprising herself with the decision. "The spare room makes more sense, at least until we can afford to build proper quarters." Vincent's expression suggested he understood the significance of the offer, not just practical accommodation, but genuine inclusion in the daily rhythms of their family life. "Are you sure? I'm sure that we're partners now, and partners help each other in practical ways." The first test of their partnership came that afternoon when Vincent surveyed the farm's equipment with the methodical attention of someone who understood the difference between appearance and function. Most of what Antonio had left behind was in worse condition than it looked, held together by hope and makeshift repairs that wouldn't survive another growing season. "The tractor needs a complete engine rebuild," Vincent reported, wiping grease from his hands with the methodical precision that marked all his actions. "The plow shares are worn down to nothing, and half the irrigation system is clogged or broken. How much will it cost to fix everything?" Vincent's hesitation told Maria the answer before he spoke. "More than we can afford with current income. Much more." They stood in the equipment shed, surrounded by the evidence of Antonio's struggles, tools purchased, second-hand and used until they broke, repairs attempted with whatever materials came to hand, the gradual deterioration that came when maintenance was constantly deferred in favor of more immediate needs. "There might be another way," Vincent said finally. "I have contacts in the agricultural supply business, people who owe me favors from the old days." "What kind of favors?" "The kind that don't involve violence or illegal activity. Just business relationships built over years of mutual benefit." Maria studied his face, trying to read the implications of what he was suggesting. "You mean calling in debts from your criminal enterprises to benefit our legitimate partnership?" "I mean using every resource available to make this farm successful, regardless of where those resources originated." The moral complexity of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. Vincent's criminal past had provided him with connections and leverage that could benefit their current enterprise, but using those advantages blurred the lines between redemption and simply finding new ways to profit from old crimes. "What would you need to do?" "Make some phone calls. Meet with some people who might be willing to provide equipment at significant discounts in exchange for past considerations." Vincent's voice was careful, neutral. "Nothing illegal, nothing that would compromise our current status. Just business." Maria thought about Sophia's drawings, about the family portrait that included Vincent, not as a dangerous stranger, but as someone who belonged with them. She thought about Elena's practical acceptance of their situation, about the way her daughters had invested their emotional security in the success of this partnership. "Do it," she said finally, "but I want to know exactly what arrangements you make and what obligations they create." "You don't trust me?" "I trust you completely. But I don't trust the world you came from, and I won't let it reach into our family's life without understanding what it might cost us." Vincent's smile carried approval as much as gratitude. "A good businesswoman asks hard questions. A good mother protects her children from consequences they didn't choose." As Vincent made his phone calls from the kitchen, while the girls did homework at the dining room table, Maria found herself listening to both conversations simultaneously. Vincent's careful negotiations with people from his past, conducted in the language of mutual benefit and professional courtesy, and her daughter's easy chatter about school assignments and weekend plans. The juxtaposition was jarring but somehow also right, as if the ordinary domestic sounds were gradually overwhelming the echoes of Vincent's criminal associations. By the time he finished his calls, having secured promises of equipment, loans, and supply discounts that would save them thousands of dollars, the kitchen felt more like a family space than a business office. "Everything arranged?" Maria asked. "Everything arranged. Legal, ethical, and documented." Vincent's satisfaction was evident. "We'll have working equipment by next week and enough seed stock to plant 40 acres come spring. And the cost?" "My reputation in certain circles, which is a price I'm happy to pay." Elena looked up from her arithmetic homework. "What reputation?" "The reputation of being someone who never asks for help," Vincent answered honestly. "Sometimes growing up means admitting you can't do everything alone." Sophia added her own observation with characteristic insight. "Mama says, asking for help is how families work." Vincent met Maria's eyes across the kitchen table, both of them recognizing the moment when their business partnership had become something more personal, more lasting, more like the family Sophia had been drawing in her pictures all along. "Then I guess," Vincent said quietly, "we're learning how to be a family." 6 months later, Maria stood in the same spot where she'd first found Vincent bleeding in the early October dawn. But everything had changed. The barn had been repaired and painted, the fields showed the green promise of a successful spring planting, and the sound of laughter carried from the house where her daughters were helping their partner prepare Sunday dinner. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been sleepless nights when old debts and older enemies threatened their fragile peace, moments when Vincent's past seemed ready to drag them all back into darkness. But there had also been mornings like this one, when the sun rose over land that belonged to them completely, free of debt and full of possibility. "Mama!" Sophia's voice called from the kitchen door. "Vincent says the roast is ready, and Elena made her special biscuits." Maria smiled at the easy way her daughter spoke Vincent's name, as if he'd always been part of their Sunday routines. The transition from dangerous stranger to family member had happened gradually, built on small moments of trust and daily acts of kindness that had accumulated into something unshakable. Vincent appeared in the doorway behind Sophia, wearing an apron that made him look more like a devoted father than a former crime boss. His hair had grown longer over the winter months, and the lines around his eyes spoke of laughter rather than violence. The expensive suits had been replaced entirely by work clothes and casual wear, the visible symbols of his transformation as complete as the invisible ones. "Elena's becoming quite the cook," he said, his pride in her accomplishments evident. "She's been teaching me some of your mother's recipes. And I've been teaching Vincent how to draw horses," Sophia added, holding up a sketch pad filled with attempts at artistic expression that showed more enthusiasm than skill. "He's getting better." The domestic scene was one Maria had never allowed herself to imagine during those dark months after Antonio's death. Her daughters thriving, their homes secure, and a man who chose every day to be worthy of the trust they'd placed in him. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was better than anything she could have hoped for. Dinner was a celebration in the way that ordinary family meals became celebrations when you'd lived through times when you weren't sure there would be enough food for everyone. Elena had indeed mastered their grandmother's biscuit recipe, and Vincent had prepared the roast with the careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to the family. "I got a letter from Father McKenna yesterday," Vincent said, as they settled around the table that had once been too big for just Maria and the girls. "The parish is planning a spring festival to raise money for the new roof, and they want to feature local businesses." "Are we a local business now?" Elena asked with the practical curiosity that still caught adults off guard. "We are indeed. Santos Romano, agricultural partners, officially recognized by the county and everything." Vincent's tone carried the satisfaction of someone who had never expected to feel pride in legitimate accomplishments. After dinner, while Elena helped with the dishes and Sophia worked on her latest artistic project, Maria and Vincent walked the boundaries of their property in the golden light of late afternoon. It had become their custom, these Sunday evening inspections that were as much about companionship as agricultural assessment. "The North Field is looking good," Vincent observed, studying the rows of corn that were already showing strong growth. "If the weather holds, we should have our best harvest in years." "Antonio would be amazed," Maria said softly. "He struggled so hard with this land, never quite able to make it profitable." "Antonio didn't have the advantages we do." "You mean the equipment loans from your former associates?" "I mean the partnership. Two people working together, sharing the load, making decisions based on what's best for the family instead of what's necessary for survival." Vincent stopped walking and turned to face her. "Antonio was trying to save the farm alone. We're building something together." The distinction was important, and they both understood it. What they'd created wasn't just a successful agricultural business, but a model for how people could help each other become better than they'd been individually. "I have something for you," Vincent said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small velvet box. "It's not what you might think," he added quickly, seeing Maria's expression. "It's something else entirely." Inside the box was a simple gold pendant, not a ring, but something more personal. The pendant bore an engraved image of the farmhouse with small figures standing in front of it, clearly based on one of Sophia's drawings. "She gave me the idea," Vincent explained. "Said you should have something beautiful to remind you of how far we've all come." Maria lifted the pendant from its box, feeling the weight of gold and meaning in her palm. "It's perfect. There's something else." Vincent's voice carried a nervousness that reminded her of the wounded man she'd first encountered. "I've been thinking about what comes next for us. Not just the farm, but the family." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I love you, Maria Santos. I love your daughters as if they were my own. I love the life we've built together, and I want to make it permanent in every way that matters." The words hung in the evening air, simple and profound and completely honest. Maria looked at this man who had transformed himself from criminal to farmer to father, who had chosen her family's welfare over his own safety, who had proven every day for 6 months that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to accept it. "I love you too," she said simply. "All of us do. Then marry me, not because you need protection or I need legitimacy, but because we've built something worth celebrating." Maria thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment, the morning she'd found him bleeding in her barn, the weeks of uncertainty and growing trust, the partnership that had become something deeper and more lasting than either of them had expected. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like a prayer answered. They were married in St. Catherine's Church on a bright morning in late spring, with Father McKenna performing the ceremony, and the entire congregation serving as witnesses to what everyone agreed was the most remarkable transformation they'd ever observed. Elena and Sophia served as bridesmaids, wearing dresses that Sophia had helped design and Elena had helped sew. The reception was held in the fellowship hall, with food provided by neighbors who had watched Maria struggle alone and were grateful to see her happiness restored. Vincent's legitimate business associates mingled with local farmers and church members, creating the kind of community celebration that made everyone feel part of something larger than themselves. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, the new family gathered in their kitchen, the same room where Maria had once counted coins and worried about unpayable debts, where Vincent had first revealed his identity, where Elena had asked hard questions and Sophia had drawn pictures of the family she hoped they could become. The family portrait on the mantelpiece had been updated to reflect their new reality, Vincent and Maria flanking Elena and Sophia in front of the farmhouse, all of them smiling with the kind of happiness that comes from surviving hardship together and choosing to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate pasts. Outside, the spring evening was warm and full of promise, with the sound of night birds calling across fields that belonged to them completely. Inside, Vincent helped Sophia with her bedtime prayers, while Maria and Elena discussed plans for expanding the vegetable garden, their voices creating the comfortable rhythms of family life. Later, as they sat together on the front porch, watching fireflies dance across their property, Maria reflected on the strange grace that had transformed a desperate act of mercy into the foundation for a life she'd never dared to imagine. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Vincent. "Giving up everything you were for this?" Vincent was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving across the land they'd worked together to restore, toward the windows where their daughters slept safely. "I didn't give up everything I was," he said finally. "I gave up everything I thought I had to be. There's a difference. And what you are now, what I am now," Vincent said, reaching for her hand in the gathering darkness, "is exactly what I was always meant to be. I just needed someone to show me mercy, so I could remember." In the distance, the church bells of St. Catherine's marked the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the countryside like a blessing. Maria Santos Romano squeezed her husband's hand and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the mysterious ways that grace could transform the most unlikely circumstances into exactly what was needed. The prayer beads that Vincent still carried in his pocket were warm against his chest, worn smooth by faithful fingers and daily use, a reminder that some transformations were worth any price. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose mercy over judgment, hope over fear, love over the easier path of solitude. But tonight, they were exactly where they belonged, a family created by courage, sustained by faith, and blessed beyond anything they'd ever dared to ask for.